In the autumn of 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Öhman was doing what he did most days that season, clearing stumps from a stretch of wooded land on his property outside a small Minnesota township. His 10-year-old son was working beside him, and wrapped in the roots of an aspen tree, pulled halfway out of the ground, was a flat grey slab of stone, covered edge to edge in strange angular markings. Öhman had no formal education past a Swedish grade school. He had no training in linguistics, no background in history, and by every account from the people who knew him, no interest in becoming famous. He was a farmer, and what he was looking at, carved into 200 pounds of rock pulled out of his own dirt, would spark an argument that has now outlasted him, his son, and every single person who was alive to see it happen, an argument that, more than a century later, still has no ending. Because if the writing on that stone means what it appears to mean, it isn't a Minnesota farm story at all. It's a record left behind by a party of Scandinavian explorers, dated to the year 1362, more than 130 years before Columbus ever left port. And the institution that has spent more time than almost any other examining that stone, weighing it, displaying it, and ultimately turning away from it, the Smithsonian institution, has never definitively proven it's fake. It just stopped looking. This is the story of what Olof Öhman found, why the world's leading experts couldn't agree on it in 1910, why they still can't agree on it now, and why the one test that could actually settle the question has never in over a century been fully run. To understand why this stone still matters, you have to understand what was riding on the answer from the very first week. By 1898, the story of Vikings reaching North America wasn't purely fringe speculation. Norse sagas describing a land called Vinland had circulated in academic circles for decades, and educated readers on both sides of the Atlantic already suspected some kind of Scandinavian contact with the continent centuries before Columbus. What nobody had was proof. No artifact, no settlement, nothing you could put in a museum case and point to. Then a farmer in rural Minnesota pulls a 14th century inscription out of the ground. If it was real, it wasn't just a curiosity. It would be one of the most significant archaeological objects ever found in North America. Physical evidence that Europeans had pushed deep into the continental interior more than a century before the voyage the entire modern telling of American history is built around. That's the tension sitting underneath every argument that followed. This was never just about one rock. It was about who got to write the first chapter of American history, and whether a Swedish immigrant farmer with no formal credentials had just rewritten it by accident. Before we go further, if stories like this one, where the official record and the physical evidence don't quite line up, are the kind of thing you find yourself thinking about after the video ends, subscribing helps more of these get made. Word of the discovery spread fast. Within weeks, the stone had been photographed, written up in regional newspapers, and put on display in the window of a bank in the nearby town of Kensington, which is where it got its name. People came from surrounding counties just to see it. For the local Scandinavian immigrant community, many of whom had crossed the Atlantic themselves only years earlier, the idea that their ancestors might have beaten Columbus to America wasn't just interesting. It was personal. It was validation, sitting right there in a bank window carved in stone. But excitement in a small Minnesota town is not the same thing as authentication. And when the stone finally reached the people whose job it was to actually read it, language experts, Scandinavian studies scholars, professors who had spent their careers studying medieval Norse texts, the reception was almost immediate and almost entirely negative. The inscription, they said, simply didn't read like 14th century Old Norse. Some of the runes used on the stone weren't documented anywhere in known medieval writing. The grammar had patterns that looked less like 1362 and more like the Swedish-American dialect spoken by immigrant farmers in Minnesota in 1898, a dialect Öhman himself would have spoken every single day of his life. To the scholars examining it, that wasn't a small inconsistency. It looked like a signature. If the stone had been carved by someone using the language patterns of their own time and place instead of the language of the world they claimed to be writing from, that's exactly what you'd expect a hoax to look like. By around 1910, the verdict from the academic mainstream was close to unanimous. The Kensington Runestone was almost certainly a fake, and the person best positioned to have carved it, a Scandinavian immigrant literate enough to attempt runic script with easy physical access to the stone before it was ever reported, was Olof Öhman himself. It should have ended there. A tidy story, overeager farmer, a bit of a prank or a bid for local fame, embarrassed scholars set the record straight, case closed. Except the case never actually closed, because a few pieces of that tidy story never fit. Öhman never tried to sell the stone. He never charged admission to see it, never wrote a book, never gave paid lectures, never moved off his farm on the strength of newfound celebrity. By every surviving account of the people who knew him, neighbours, fellow immigrants, people with no reason to defend him, he seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention the stone brought him. If this was a hoax built for money or fame, it's one of the strangest hoaxes on record because the man at the centre of it never collected on either. And there was a second problem, a bigger one. It just took scholars decades to notice it. Here's where the story takes its first real turn, because the exact same evidence that convinced early scholars the stone was fake would later become the evidence some of them couldn't explain away. Remember what damned the stone in 1910? Unusual runes and grammar that looks suspiciously modern. Case closed, or so it seemed, until researchers, working decades after Öhman had already died, started digging through obscure medieval Scandinavian archives that simply hadn't been catalogued, translated, or published back in 1898. And there, buried in real 14th century documents nobody had access to when Öhman was alive, they started finding some of the exact same impossible rune forms. Language patterns that had been used as proof of a hoax turned out to exist in genuine medieval writing that wouldn't be discovered and published by scholars until well into the 20th century. Sit with what that actually means. If Olof Öhman faked this stone in 1898, he would have had to correctly guess the existence of obscure medieval Scandinavian dialect forms that professional linguists themselves didn't know existed until decades after he was in the ground. A Minnesota farmer with a grade school education would have had to out-research the future of an entire academic field just to make his forgery convincing, using knowledge that, as far as anyone can tell, didn't exist anywhere for him to find. That doesn't prove the stone is real, but it broke the clean, simple story wide open. The obvious modern forgery theory now had a hole in it that nobody has ever fully patched, and that's when the geology got involved. In the early 2000s, a forensic geologist named Scott Walter was brought in to examine the stone using tools 19th century linguists never had: microscopic analysis of the mineral weathering inside the carved grooves themselves. Rock doesn't lie the way language can be imitated. Weathering happens at a measurable rate. Walter's petrographic analysis concluded that the wear pattern inside those carved lines was consistent with an age far older than 130 years, potentially consistent with centuries of exposure, not decades. If that holds up, it means the inscription couldn't have been carved in 1898 at all, which would mean either the stone really is what it claims to be, or something about its history is far stranger and far older than a simple immigrant hoax. Not everyone accepts Walter's conclusions. Mainstream runologists, serious ones, not fringe theorists, remain genuinely divided. Henrik Williams, a respected runologist at Uppsala University who has spent years studying the inscription directly, has said publicly that in his expert judgment he cannot find another medieval Scandinavian text that reads quite like this one. That's a real credentialed expert opinion, and it should carry weight. But Williams has also said something else, something that almost never makes it into the confident one-sided version of this story you'll find elsewhere. He said the case for a 19th century origin is not complete either. Not the stone is authentic. Not the stone is fake. A genuine working expert telling you plainly that after all this time, nobody has actually closed the file. Which brings us to the Smithsonian. The Kensington Runestone has passed through the Smithsonian Institution's hands more than once over the past century, examined, photographed, displayed publicly in Washington. And after all of that institutional access, all those resources, all that expertise under one roof, the Smithsonian's position has landed, like most of the academic mainstream, on skepticism. Probably not authentic, probably. Not definitively disproven, not conclusively dated, not the result of the one test that could plausibly settle this once and for all. A full, independent, modern petrographic reanalysis conducted transparently, with the raw data published for other scientists to check. More than 100 years and multiple institutions with the resources to run that test conclusively, and it still hasn't happened in a way both sides of this debate accept. That's the part of this story that should bother you more than any rune on the stone itself. Not that the Kensington Runestone might be fake. It might be. Plenty of serious, credentialed people think it is. But might be fake, and we ran every test available and confirmed it, are two very different sentences. And institutions with the power to tell them apart have spent over a century choosing to let the first one stand in for the second. So where does that leave the actual object, the 200 pounds of stone sitting behind glass today? The Kensington Runestone is on permanent display at the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, not far from where Oman first pulled it from the ground. People still travel to see it. Scholars still publish papers arguing both sides. Every few years someone announces a new test, a new analysis, a new piece of the puzzle, and every time the needle moves a little and then stops well short of an ending. What we're actually left with, when you strip away everyone's confidence in their own conclusion, is this. A farmer with nothing to gain found something he almost certainly couldn't have faked using the knowledge available to him in 1898. Scholars using tools from a century later found weathering evidence that argues against a recent forgery. And the institutions with the standing to run the one test that might settle it for good have for over 100 years stopped just short of doing it and let, probably not, quietly, do the job that definitely not, never could. Maybe one day, better instruments, a fully transparent reanalysis, or a document nobody's found yet will finally close this file for good, one way or the other. Or maybe the Kensington Runestone was always destined to sit exactly where it sits now. Not proven, not disproven, just unresolved, the same way it's been since the day a 10-year-old boy noticed something strange caught in the roots of a tree. What do you think actually happened in that field in 1898? An elaborate hoax from a man who never profited from it, or a genuine record the world has spent 125 years refusing to fully test? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next investigation.